The dust had been a constant companion for 3 days. A fine, reddish powder that worked its way into the seams of Lydia Rose McKenna's traveling dress, into the folds of her bonnet, and onto the pages of the book she'd long since given up trying to read. It settled on her tongue, a gritty testament to the miles stretching between who she was and who she was supposed to become. Kansas was a memory now, a place of flat, open promises that had turned brittle and snapped clean in two. Larkspur Hollow, somewhere deep in the rugged heart of the West, was to be her new beginning. Though she felt none of the hope the phrase implied, to her, it was simply next. The stagecoach lurched, its wooden wheels finding a rut in the sun-baked road, and Lydia braced herself with a gloved hand against the worn leather seat. Outside, the landscape was a study in browns and golds, vast and unforgiving under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. It was a land that didn't care for sentiment, and for that, Lydia was grateful. Sentiment was a luxury she could no longer afford. Her pocketbook held a letter from a distant cousin of her mother's, a man who served as the postmaster in Larkspur Hollow. It promised a position sorting mail, selling stamps, managing the telegraph key when he was away. It was respectable work, quiet work. It required no smiles, no charm, no pieces of a heart she no longer possessed. It was perfect. The breakup, if it could even be called that, had been as quiet as a prayer said in an empty church. There had been no shouting, no thrown china, no dramatic, rain-soaked goodbyes. There had only been Arthur, his face a mask of polite disappointment, standing in the parlor of the small home they were supposed to have shared. "It's not you, Lydia," he'd said, which was always the preamble to it being entirely her. You've changed." She had simply looked at him, her hands folded in her lap. She hadn't denied it. Of course she had changed. The world changed people. Sickness had taken her father, leaving debts that had taken their farm. Hardship had etched new lines around her eyes and taught her a silence that Arthur, a man of easy laughter and simpler truths, had come to mistake for disapproval. The bright, hopeful girl he had courted was gone, worn away by reality. "You're not the woman I fell in love with," he'd concluded, his voice soft with a pity that felt worse than any anger. "That girl, she was simpler, happier." He wanted a girl, not a woman. He wanted a smooth surface, not the grain and knots of seasoned wood. She had changed. Yes, she had become herself, forged in a fire he had never had to walk through. And for that, she was being set aside. She had not wept. The well inside her felt as dry as the plains outside the coach window. She'd simply nodded, packed the one trunk that held all that was truly hers, and accepted the postmaster's offer. Love, she had decided, was a fool's bargain, an investment in something that could be rescinded at any moment, for reasons as flimsy as a change in the weather. She would rely on herself now. Her mind was made up. The driver's call from up top broke through her reverie. Larkspur Hollow end of the line. Lydia straightened her bonnet and peered out the window. The town emerged from the heat haze not as a bustling hub of commerce, but as a handful of weathered wooden buildings huddled together as if for comfort. There was a general store with a sagging porch, a blacksmith's forge from which the rhythmic clang of a hammer echoed, a saloon whose bat-wing doors swung lazily in the faint breeze, and, further down the single dusty street, a small, neat building with a sign that read Larkspur Hollow Post and Telegraph. The coach groaned to a halt in a cloud of its own making. When the dust began to settle, Lydia saw the small crowd that had gathered a few women with baskets, a couple of older men loafing on a bench, a boy chasing a stray dog. They were all looking, their faces a mixture of curiosity and ingrained suspicion reserved for newcomers. This was her new life, a collection of strangers who would watch her, whisper about her, and eventually forget she had ever been new. The door was opened by the coachman, and Lydia gathered her reticule and her dignity, preparing to step down into the oppressive afternoon heat As her foot touched the stepping block, her gaze swept across the faces before her and snagged on one. He wasn't part of the welcoming committee. He stood apart, leaning against a support post of the livery stable across the way. He was tall, built of long lines and quiet strength, with shoulders that spoke of physical labor. A dusty, pale coat hung on his frame, worn and comfortable. Not for show. His hat was low, casting his face in shadow, but she could feel the weight of his attention. He wasn't staring with the overt, appraising curiosity of the other men. His was a look of simple, steady observation. He was just watching. As she straightened up on the solid ground, her ankles a bit unsteady after days of travel, he pushed himself off the post. For a moment, she thought he might approach, and an involuntary knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. She did not want to be spoken to be questioned, to be welcomed. She wanted to be invisible. But he did not move toward her. He simply stood to his full height, and from beneath the shadow of his hat brim, their eyes met. His were the color of a stormy sky. She thought, gray and deep. There was no judgment in them, no welcome, no warning. They were just eyes, looking at her, seeing her. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a greeting so much as an acknowledgement of her existence, as brief and final as the closing of a door. Then he turned, his long-legged stride eating up the ground, and disappeared into the cavernous darkness of the livery. Lydia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The encounter had lasted no more than 5 seconds, but it left an impression, like a thumbprint on wet clay. While the others had looked at her as a novelty, the new woman. The postmaster's clerk, he had looked at her as if she were just a person, standing in the dust. The quiet finality of his nod felt strangely respectful, a granting of the very privacy she craved. "Miss McKenna." The voice was thin and reedy. She turned to see a small, balding man with spectacles perched on his nose, wiping his hands on a smudged apron. "I'm Horace Finch, postmaster. Welcome to Larkspur Hollow." "Mr. Finch," she replied, her own voice sounding rusty to her ears. "Thank you for the opportunity." "Nonsense, nonsense. Happy to have the help," he said, already turning to direct a lanky youth to fetch her trunk. "It's not much of a town, but it's honest. Your room is above the dressmaker's shop. Just there. Mrs. Hannah's place. She's expecting you." Lydia murmured her thanks, her gaze drifting back to the livery stable. The dark entryway was empty now, holding its secrets. She wondered who he was, the man with the quiet eyes and the dusty coat. He felt like a part of the landscape, as solid and unyielding as the distant mountains. A man who looked at the world and didn't feel the need to fill the silence with useless words. A pang of something not loneliness, not regret, but a hollow echo of what used to be stirred within her. She quickly smothered it. She was here to work, to earn her keep, to be left alone. She would be Lydia Rose McKenna, the clerk at the post office. She would be polite, efficient, and distant. She would build a wall of quiet duty around herself, and no one would ever get close enough to see her change again. She followed Mr. Finch down the street, the dust of Larkspur Hollow puffing up around the hem of her skirt, already claiming her. The town was small, and the people's lives were likely interwoven in a tapestry of gossip and shared history she would never be a part of. That was fine. She had no desire for threads that could tangle and bind. She was here for solitude. And as for the tall stranger, he was just a man, a flicker of a moment. She would likely never see him again. She told herself that, and for some reason, the thought brought not relief, but a curious, unplaceable emptiness. The room above Mrs. Hannah's dressmaking shop was small, but it was clean, and it was hers. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt was pushed against one wall, a washstand with a plain white basin and pitcher against the other. A single window overlooked the dusty main street of Larkspur Hollow, and it was through this window that Lydia watched the town wake and sleep. The scent of beeswax and old wood filled the small space, a comforting, solid smell that was a world away from the cloying perfume of regret she'd left behind in Kansas. Mrs. Elspeth Hannah, the owner of the shop and the room, was a woman carved from the same resilient timber as the town itself, a widow for 20 years. She had a web of fine lines around her eyes that spoke more of knowing smiles than of sorrow. She was short, sturdy, and moved with a quiet efficiency that Lydia admired. Mrs. Hannah asked no questions about Lydia's past. She seemed to understand that some stories are best left packed away, like winter clothes in summertime. Her kindness came in small, unobtrusive gestures, a cup of hot chamomile tea left on the landing in the evening, a freshly baked biscuit wrapped in a napkin placed on Lydia's dresser in the morning. "A body needs something solid to start the day," she'd said once, her needle flying as she mended a farmer's canvas coat. "The world's less daunting on a full stomach." Lydia found she agreed. She fell into a routine that was as steady and predictable as the sun's journey across the sky. Each morning, she would descend the narrow staircase, not a quiet greeting to Mrs. Hannah, and walk the 20 yards to the post office. There, she would immerse herself in the tangible world of letters and parcels. She loved the crisp feel of unopened envelopes, the heft of a well-wrapped package, the faint, varied sense of 100 different homes that clung to the mailbags. She learned the rhythms of the telegraph key, the sharp, staccato clicks, a language all their own, carrying urgent news of births and deaths, of business deals and lonely pleas from soldiers stationed in distant forts. Mr. Finch, the postmaster, was a man who appreciated order and silence, and he found Lydia to be the perfect clerk. She was meticulous. Her ledger was always balanced, and she never engaged in the idle gossip that was the town's primary currency. The townsfolk, in turn, didn't quite know what to make of her. She was polite but reserved. She would answer direct questions about postage rates or telegraph fees, but her face was a pleasant, impenetrable mask against any personal inquiries. Mrs. Gable, the wife of the general store owner and the town's primary purveyor of news, tried once. "You're a long way from home, dear," she'd said, leaning conspiratorially over the counter as Lydia weighed her letter. "Must be hard, a single woman all on her own." Lydia met her gaze, her expression unchanging. "The postage is 3 cents, Mrs. Gable." The woman's smile faltered. She paid her money and left, and the attempt was not made again. Lydia was simply accepted as a quiet fixture, like the horse trough in the center of town, useful, present, but not a source of conversation. And then, one Tuesday morning, the bell above the door jingled, and the quiet of the post office was filled by a presence she recognized before she even looked up. It was him, the man from the livery. He moved with a deliberate lack of haste, his worn boots making little sound on the wooden floorboards. He removed his hat as he entered, a gesture of ingrained respect that many men in Larkspur Hollow neglected. His hair was the color of dark earth, thick and a little unruly. Without the hat's shadow, she could see his face more clearly. It was a strong face, weathered by sun and wind, with a firm jaw and lines around his eyes that suggested he spent a lot of time looking toward the horizon. He was not handsome in the way Arthur had been. There were no smooth, easy lines. This man's face was a map of his life, and Lydia found her eyes tracing it before she quickly looked down at her inkwell, a faint, unwelcome warmth creeping up her neck. He stopped at the counter and placed a small stack of folded letters before her. His hands were clean, but permanently calloused, the knuckles scarred. They were the hands of a man who worked, and worked hard. "Morning, ma'am," he said. His voice was a low baritone, a gravelly sound like stones shifting in a riverbed. "Good morning," she replied, her own voice steady, betraying none of the sudden flutter in her chest. She gestured to the letters. "Where are these headed?" "Fort Laramie. For the soldiers. He didn't elaborate. He didn't explain who he was, or why he was sending mail to soldiers. He just stated the fact. She weighed them, calculated the postage, and stamped each one with a firm, definitive thud. The entire transaction took less than a minute. He paid in coin, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second as she gave him his change. His touch was rough but surprisingly warm. He nodded, the same brief, acknowledging gesture she remembered from her arrival. Much obliged. He put his hat back on and was gone, leaving behind the faint, clean scent of hay, leather, and open air. Lydia stood still for a long moment, her eyes on the door. Cullen Wade. That's what Mr. Finch had called him later that day. Runs the horse ranch just east of town. Good man, quiet man. Used to be a soldier himself. I hear. He came in every week or so after that. His visits became a silent, unspoken part of her routine. He never tried to make small talk, never offered an unnecessary word. Yet, a conversation began to unfold between them, one conducted in the spaces between words. One day, he placed a letter on the counter and said, "Looks like rain." Lydia glanced out the window at the gathering clouds. "Yes, it does." That was all. But the way he said it, a simple statement of fact, felt like an invitation to share the moment, to observe the same patch of sky. Another time, he came in looking more tired than usual, a dark smudge of dirt high on his cheekbone. He was sending a small, clumsily wrapped parcel. "For one of my hands," he explained, as if sensing a question she hadn't asked. "His wife's passed on, and his boy's back east. The lad likes licorice." Lydia looked from the package to his face, and for the first time, she offered something more than professional courtesy. That's a kind thing to do. A flicker of something surprise, maybe passed through his gray eyes. He just gave a small shrug, as if kindness were as practical and necessary as shoeing a horse. A man ought to look after his own. She began to notice things, the way he always seemed to know the exact postage, as if he'd weighed the letters in his hand before coming in. The way his gaze would sometimes rest on her hands as she worked the stamp, a look of quiet concentration. And she, in turn, learned to read the small signs of his life. Mud on his boots meant he'd been down by the creek. A frayed rope in his hand meant he was heading to the general store for supplies. A new line of exhaustion around his eyes meant a long night helping a mare give birth. Their dialogues remained spare, fragments of observation about the world around them. Wind's picking up. The creek's running high. Saw a hawk over the ridge this morning. And her replies were just as simple. It'll be a cold night. We needed the water. They're beautiful birds. She never asked about his ranch, his family, or his past, and he never asked where she was from, why she was alone, or if she ever smiled. He simply accepted her as she was the quiet woman behind the post office counter. He took her silence not as a rejection, but as a language he also understood. In a town where everyone else seemed to want to pull her story out of her, he was the only one who seemed content to let her be. One afternoon, as he was leaving, he paused at the door and turned back. "Mrs., Hannah makes the best apple pie in this territory. Ma'am, be sure to try a piece if she offers." He was gone before she could form a reply. Lydia stood in the quiet room, the scent of his presence lingering faintly in the air. For the first time in a very long time, a genuine, unbidden smile touched her lips. It felt like a foreign gesture, a muscle she hadn't used in years. She looked down at the counter, at the ink stain on her finger, and realized that the thick, gray numbness that had enveloped her for so long was beginning to thin, just a little. And it was all because of a quiet man who spoke in nods and observations, and who asked for nothing at all. The day had ended as quietly as it began, with Lydia tidying the last of the accounts in Mr. Finch's ledger. The sky outside the post office window, however, had been engaged in a slow, theatrical drama. What began as a high, hazy veil of white had gradually thickened and curdled, the afternoon sun turning from a brilliant gold to a pale, watery silver before vanishing entirely. By the time she was meant to close, the world beyond the glass was a canvas of bruised purple and ominous gray. Lydia was not a woman easily flustered by weather. She had seen Kansas skies turn a sickly green before a hailstorm and had huddled through blizzards that buried fences. But this was different. This was a mountain storm, and it arrived with a sudden, violent finality. The first drops were fat and isolated, splatting against the dusty street like dark coins. They were followed by a low rumble that seemed to vibrate up from the very bedrock of the town. And then the sky opened. It was not rain so much as a solid sheet of falling water. It hit the tin roof of the post office with a steady, insistent drumming that quickly escalated into a deafening roar. Within minutes, the street was gone, replaced by a churning river of mud. A loose shutter on the general store across the way began to bang a frantic, desperate rhythm against the clapboard. Lydia stood at the door, her hand on the latch, and knew she was not going anywhere. She was not afraid, annoyed, perhaps, at the inconvenience, but not afraid. She was good at waiting. Her entire life, it seemed, had become an exercise in waiting for a harvest to come in, for a sickness to pass, for a man's love to solidify into commitment, for the pain of its absence to dull. She could wait out a storm. She lit the lamp on the counter, its golden glow pushing back against the gloomy twilight, and settled into her chair. The world shrank to the small, orderly room, the scent of ink and paper a familiar comfort. The roar of the storm was a constant, a force of nature that demanded nothing of her. An hour passed, then another. The shutter across the way finally tore loose from one of its hinges and fell silent. The fury of the rain did not abate. She must have dozed, her head resting on her folded arms on the counter. What woke her was a change in the light, a second, weaker glow piercing the deluge. She lifted her head, blinking, and saw the spectral light of a lantern bobbing its way through the downpour. It was coming from a buckboard wagon, pulled by two dark, solid shapes that she recognized as horses. The wagon moved slowly, cautiously, its wheels sucking at the deep mud. It pulled to a stop directly in front of the post office. Lydia's heart gave a sudden, unwelcome lurch. No one had any business being out in this. She watched, her breath held, as a tall figure swung down from the driver's seat. He was wrapped in a dark, waterproof slicker. His hat pulled low, but she knew the set of his shoulders. She knew the long, deliberate stride even as it was hampered by the mud. It was Cullen Wade. He reached the wooden boardwalk in 2 long steps, the water streaming from his hat and coat. He didn't knock. He simply opened the door, bringing a gust of wind and the smell of rain-soaked earth into the small room. He closed it carefully behind him, shutting out the storm's roar once more. He pushed back his dripping hat. His face was beaded with rain, and his hair was plastered to his forehead. His gray eyes found hers in the lamplight. "Evening, Miss McKenna," he said, his voice the same low, steady rumble as always. "Figured you might still be here."
"Mr. Wade,"
she said, her voice a little thick with sleep.
"It's a bad night."
"It is," he agreed. He didn't ask what she was doing here so late. He didn't comment on her being alone. He just looked at her, then at the torrent of water visible through the window. "You need a ride?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, as plain and simple as his observations about the weather. Lydia's first instinct, born of years of determined self-reliance, was to refuse, to say she was fine, that she would wait. But looking at him, so solid and real in the lamplight, and then at the violent chaos outside, the refusal died on her lips. It would be foolish. It would be prideful.
"Yes,"
she said softly.
"I would appreciate that."
He nodded once. "Get your things." The journey of 20 yards to the wagon was a battle. He held her arm in a firm, impersonal grip, his strength a steady anchor against the wind that tried to tear her shawl from her shoulders. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, his hands briefly at her waist, and she was struck again by their warmth and solidness, even through the layers of wet fabric. He settled a heavy canvas sheet over her lap and then climbed up beside her, taking the reins. The world inside the wagon was a small, dark, swaying cocoon. The rain hammered on the canvas roof above them, a relentless drumming that made conversation impossible, for which Lydia was profoundly grateful. What would they even say? The lantern hanging from a hook cast a faint, flickering light, illuminating his profile as he focused on guiding the horses through the treacherous street. It was a strong profile, all angles and quiet determination. She sat stiffly, her hands clenched in her lap, feeling the strangeness of the situation. She was alone in the dark with a man she barely knew, dependent on his kindness. Arthur would have filled this silence with nervous chatter, with 100 questions meant to sound like concern, but which were really just a demand to be reassured. Cullen said nothing. He simply drove, his entire being focused on the task of getting them safely to their destination. After a few minutes, he turned his head slightly toward her. The noise of the storm forced him to raise his voice, but it lost none of its quiet quality.
Are you cold?
He asked. The simple, practical question undid a knot inside her she hadn't known was there. He wasn't asking if she was frightened, or lonely, or regretting her decision to move to this wild place. He was asking if she was cold, a simple, physical fact, a need he could meet.
A little,
she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. He reached behind the seat without a word and pulled out a thick, heavy wool blanket. It smelled of cedar and clean wool. He unfolded it and draped it over her shoulders, tucking it in around her. The weight of it was immediate, a comforting, grounding pressure. The warmth began to seep into her bones, chasing away the chill. She pulled it tighter, the rough texture soft against her cheek. The rest of the short journey passed in that same companionable silence. When they finally stopped in front of Mrs. Hannah's shop, the rain had eased from a roar to a steady, heavy drumming. "We're here," he said. He was down from the wagon before she could thank him, rounding the side to help her descend. He took her hand, and his grip was sure and steady as she navigated the step down into the ankle-deep mud. He walked with her to the base of the covered stairs leading up to her room, the lantern in his other hand casting their long shadows against the wet wood. At the foot of the stairs, under the relative shelter of the overhang, she turned to face him. The lantern light illuminated the raindrops clinging to his eyelashes and the tired lines around his eyes. She had to thank him. She had to say something. But her old fears, the ghosts of past hurts, rose up in her. This feeling, this warmth, this sense of being cared for, was dangerous. It was a hook, and she had learned that hooks always had a price. She had to warn him. She had to give him an escape. "I change my mind a lot," she said, the words coming out in a rush, a little breathless. "About things, about people. It's just how I am." She was laying her greatest fault, the very reason for her exile, at his feet. Asterisk. "You see, asterisk," she was saying. "Asterisk, I am not a safe harbor. I am shifting sand." Cullen didn't react immediately. He just looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face in the flickering light. The rain dripped from the brim of his hat. He seemed to be considering her words not as a warning, but as a piece of important information. Then he spoke, and his voice was so low and certain it seemed to silence the rain itself. "I don't," he said. He held her gaze, and she felt the weight of his next words settle deep inside her. "When I care about something, Miss McKenna, I don't change my mind." Lydia stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. He wasn't frightened by her warning. He hadn't recoiled. He had simply met her truth with his own. A deep, unshakable truth that stood in stark opposition to everything she had come to believe about the world. A faint, tremulous smile touched her lips. It was small, and it probably looked fragile, but it was real. He saw it. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The same gesture of acknowledgement she'd seen on her first day in town. He turned without another word, walked back to his wagon, and with a soft click of the reins, disappeared back into the rainy darkness. Lydia stood there for a long moment, the heavy blanket still around her shoulders, its warmth a tangible reminder of his presence. Then she turned and slowly climbed the stairs to her room. The story had begun. The world felt different after the storm. The air, washed clean of its perpetual dust, smelled of damp earth and pine. A fragile, unfamiliar lightness had settled in Lydia's chest, a feeling she was hesitant to name but which felt dangerously like hope. His words echoed in the quiet moments of her day. When I care about something, I don't change my mind. It was a statement as solid and real as the mountains on the horizon, a landmark in the shifting landscape of her own uncertainty. For a few days, this quiet warmth held. When Cullen Wade came into the post office, the space between them no longer felt like a chasm of silence, but a comfortable, shared quiet. She met his gaze directly now, and the small, polite smile she offered was genuine. He would ask about her day, and she would answer. She, in turn, might ask if his new foal was steady on its feet. Their conversations were still brief, still built of simple things, but they were no longer just observations about the weather. They were small bridges, built one plank at a time. Lydia found herself noticing the town with new eyes. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer sounded less like a chore and more like a heartbeat. The scent of baking bread from the mercantile was a comfort. She even found a small measure of peace in the predictable nosiness of the townswomen. It was all part of a life, a real life, that was slowly beginning to feel like it could be hers. But Larkspur Hollow, like any small, isolated place, had a darker currency than coin or goodwill. It traded in whispers, and the whispers began, as they always do, in the corners of rooms and over fences, quiet enough to be denied, but loud enough to be heard. It started at the general store. Lydia was waiting for Mr. Gable to weigh out a bag of flour when she heard Mrs. Gable speaking in a low, conspiratorial tone to another woman near the bolt fabric table. A deserter, they say," Mrs. Gable murmured, her voice carrying in the quiet store. "Just up and left his post during the war. Said he had his reasons, but a man who runs once will run again." The other woman, a rancher's wife Lydia didn't know, clucked her tongue. "And him spending so much time mooning over the new post clerk. He does this every time a new, unattached woman comes to town. Remember that school teacher from 2 summers back? He was at her side day and night until she packed up and left." Lydia froze, her back to them. Her blood ran cold. The flour sack on the scale suddenly seemed immensely heavy. She felt their eyes on her, sharp and dissecting. She paid for her flour without turning, her movements stiff, and walked out of the store into a world that had suddenly lost all its color. A deserter, a man who runs, a man who only likes the novelty of a new face. Each phrase was a perfectly aimed dart, striking the most vulnerable, most wounded parts of her. Arthur's parting words came rushing back. "You're not the woman I fell in love with." He had run, too, when she had ceased to be new and simple. The pattern was terrifyingly familiar. Cullen's steadfastness, the very quality she had begun to cling to, was a lie. His quietness was not strength. It was the concealment of a coward's past. His attention was not special. It was a habit. The fragile hope in her chest shattered like thin ice. In its place, the old, familiar armor of indifference settled, heavier and colder than before. She had been a fool. She had let a kind gesture on a rainy night and a few quiet words undo years of hard-won caution. Her retreat was swift and absolute. She built her walls back up, higher and thicker this time, mortared with the bitter certainty of betrayal. The next time Cullen came into the post office, he found a different woman waiting for him. "Morning, Miss McKenna," he said, his voice holding its usual quiet warmth as he placed a letter on the counter.
Good morning,
she replied, her tone clipped and cool. She did not look up from her ledger. She weighed his letter, stamped it, and stated the price, her eyes fixed on a point just past his shoulder. The comfortable silence between them was gone, replaced by a tense, brittle quiet. She felt his confusion. She could feel his gaze on her, questioning, but he said nothing. He paid, took his change, and stood there for a moment too long. "Everything all right?" he finally asked, his voice low.
Everything is fine, Mr.
"Wade," she said, finally meeting his eyes with a look of polite, unassailable distance. "Is there anything else?" The hurt that flickered in his gray eyes was unmistakable, but it was quickly masked by his own reserved nature. He just shook his head slowly, put on his hat, and left. Lydia watched him go, her heart a tight, painful knot in her chest. Asterisk, this is for the best. She told herself. Asterisk, this is how you protect yourself. The ultimate test came a few days later. A young man who worked on Cullen's ranch, a boy named Billy with a shock of red hair and a shy smile, came into the post office. He was holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Evenin', Miss McKenna," he said, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Mr. Wade, he asked me to give this to you. He was heading up to the high pastures and wouldn't be in town." Lydia looked at the parcel in the boy's hands as if it were a snake, a gift, a tether, another plank in a bridge she was determined to burn.
I can't accept it,
she said, her voice flat. Billy's eyes widened. "But it's just a book, ma'am. He said he heard you like to read, and he had an extra copy of this one." A book, a small, thoughtful gesture that, a week ago, would have made her heart sing. Now, it felt like a trap. "Please return it to Mr. Wade and tell him I have more than enough to read," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Thank you, Billy." The boy looked from her cold face to the rejected package and back again, his own face a mask of confusion and disappointment. He mumbled an apology, as if he had done something wrong, and backed out of the shop. Lydia watched him go, then sank into her chair, the silence of the room pressing in on her. She had done it. She had pushed him away. She should have felt relief, the cold, clean satisfaction of safety. Instead, all she felt was a profound and aching emptiness. That evening, she was sitting in the parlor of Mrs. Hannah's shop, ostensibly helping the older woman sort a box of buttons, but her hands were still and her gaze was lost somewhere in the darkness outside the window. Mrs. Hannah, who saw everything and said little, stitched away in her rocking chair, the rhythmic dip and pull of her needle the only sound in the room. "The tongues in this town," Mrs. Hannah said, not looking up from her work, "have more poison in them than a cornered rattlesnake, and they're twice as quick to strike at anything they don't understand." Lydia started, surprised by the sudden observation. "I don't know what you mean." "Mrs. Hannah snipped a thread with her teeth. "I mean a good man's character is being torn to shreds by women who have nothing better to do than flap their gums, and I mean a good woman is letting them do it." She finally looked up, her gaze sharp but not unkind. "You've been walking around looking like you're carrying the weight of the world again. Child, the lightness I saw in you last week is gone." Lydia looked down at the buttons in her lap, a jumble of bone and shell and glass.
"People aren't always what they seem,"
she murmured. "No, they are not," Mrs. Hannah agreed, her voice softening. "Sometimes they're better, and sometimes the stories people tell are more about the teller than the person they're talking about." She set her sewing aside and leaned forward, her expression earnest. "I've known Cullen Wade since he was a boy who came back from the war with old man's eyes. He's quiet because he's seen things that don't need talking about, and he's kind because he knows the world has enough cruelty in it already. He is not a man who runs." Lydia's throat felt tight. She wanted to believe her, but the fear was too strong.
He'll get tired of me,
she whispered, the words she'd never dared say aloud.
I'll change, and he'll leave. They always do. Mrs.
Hannah reached across and placed her warm, needle-pricked hand over Lydia's cold ones.
Oh, child,
she said gently,
you're allowed to change your mind. Lord knows, the world changes it for us often enough. That's just part of living.
but if you find someone who doesn't walk away when you do, if you find someone who plants his feet and waits for you to find your way back, well, that's the one to hold on to. The words settled over Lydia, a quiet benediction. They didn't erase her fear, but they challenged it. They offered a different way of seeing things, a possibility she had never considered, that the problem wasn't her own inconsistency, but the inability of others to weather it. She looked at Mrs. Hannah, at the deep wisdom etched into her face, and felt the first crack appear in her newly rebuilt wall. Mrs. Hannah's words did not offer Lydia peace. They offered a battlefield. For days, her mind was a constant war, the town's ugly whispers clashing against the old woman's quiet wisdom. She would be sorting mail, and a phrase would surface unbidden, asterisk, a man who runs once will run again, asterisk, and her hands would still, the paper suddenly feeling brittle in her grasp. Then, Mrs. Hannah's voice would counter it, asterisk, if you find someone who doesn't walk away when you do, that's the one to hold on to. Sleep offered little respite. She would dream of running, her feet heavy as if caught in deep mud, while behind her, two figures called her name. One was Arthur, his voice laced with disappointment. The other was Cullen, his voice a low rumble she couldn't quite make out. She always woke before she could see which one she was running from. Her carefully constructed walls of professional distance at the post office began to feel less like a fortress and more like a prison. The silence she had once cultivated for protection now felt suffocating. She missed the easy quiet she had shared with Cullen. She missed the simple observations about the weather that were never just about the weather. She missed the steady, unquestioning gray of his eyes. She realized, with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, that her retreat had been its own form of desertion. She had abandoned the fragile bridge between them based on hearsay and fear. She had judged him without a trial, convicted him on the testimony of gossips, and in doing so, she had become the very thing she accused him of being, a person who runs. The hypocrisy of it settled deep in her gut, a cold, hard stone. If she was going to be afraid, she decided one morning, watching the sunrise paint the sky in pale shades of rose and gold, then she would be afraid while moving forward, not while standing still. She had to know the truth, not the town's version of it, and the only way to do that was to face him. She had to give him the truth of who she was, the difficult, changeable, untrusting woman she had become, and let him make his own choice. She would not hide behind a counter or a cold demeanor. She would walk straight into the battlefield of her own making. The opportunity came that Saturday. The town was holding its annual Founders' Day picnic in the wide, grassy meadow that bordered the creek. It was a day of rare, communal ease. The air was filled with the scent of roasted corn and fresh-cut hay, the sound of a slightly out-of-tune fiddle, and the high, bright laughter of children. Lydia, who normally would have stayed in her room with a book, put on her best day dress, a simple calico of pale blue, and walked toward the gathering. Every step was a negotiation with the voice in her head that screamed at her to turn back. The whole of Larkspur Hollow seemed to be there, spread out on patchwork quilts, sharing plates of fried chicken and potato salad. Lydia scanned the crowd, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She saw him almost immediately. He was not in the center of the festivities. He stood near the edge of the meadow, under the shade of a massive cottonwood tree, watching the horses tethered nearby. He was talking to a few of his ranch hands, but even in conversation, he seemed a step removed, an observer more than a participant. He looked solid and calm, a point of stillness in the swirling social eddy. She took a deep breath, the scent of grass and food filling her lungs, and began to walk toward him. It felt like the longest walk of her life. She was acutely aware of the eyes that turned to watch her, the new post clerk, who kept to herself, making a direct line for the town's quietest and most rumored-about man. She could feel the whispers starting up behind her like the rustle of dry leaves. She ignored them. For the first time, their opinions felt small and distant. As she drew closer, one of his hands saw her and nudged him. Cullen turned. The quiet conversation stopped. He watched her approach, his expression unreadable, his hat tipped low against the afternoon sun. He didn't smile, but he didn't turn away. "Mr. Wade," she said when she finally reached him, her voice steadier than she expected. "May I have a word with you?" His men, with a shared, knowing glance, tipped their hats and melted back toward the picnic. Cullen's gaze remained on her. "Miss McKenna," he said, his tone even. He gestured with his head toward the creek, away from the noise of the crowd. "We can talk over here." She walked beside him, the tall grass brushing against her skirt. The sound of the fiddle and the laughter faded, replaced by the gentle murmur of the creek and the sigh of the wind in the cottonwood leaves. They stopped by the water's edge, where flat, sun-warmed stones lined the bank. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Lydia stared at the water as it tumbled over the smooth stones, trying to gather the words she had practiced 100 times in her mind. Now that she was here, they all felt clumsy and inadequate. He waited. His patience was a tangible thing, a quiet space he created for her to fill. He did not fidget or press her. He simply stood, his hands in his pockets, and waited. Finally, she turned to face him, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "I owe you an apology," she began, the words feeling small. "I have been unkind and unfair." He said nothing, just continued to watch her, his expression serious. She took another breath. "I came to this town to be left alone. I thought that was what I wanted. I didn't want to trust anyone, because I learned that people leave. And when you were kind to me, it frightened me." She paused, her voice trembling slightly. "So I listened to gossip. I listened to whispers because it was easier than listening to my own heart, and I used them as an excuse to push you away." She looked down at her hands, twisting a loose thread on her dress. "This isn't about the rumors. Not really. This is about me. I need you to know who I am." She looked up, her gaze direct and unflinching, laying her soul bare. "I am not a predictable woman. Mr. Wade, I am not easy. There is a part of me that is always looking for the nearest exit. One day, I might feel like I can build a life here, that I can put down roots so deep they touch the bedrock. And the very next day," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "I might wake up with an urge so strong to just disappear that it feels like I can't breathe the same air another minute." She had said it. She had given him her flawed, broken truth. She had handed him the weapon and shown him exactly where to strike. Now, all that was left was for him to use it to give her a polite nod, an excuse about his horses, and walk away forever. She braced herself for the impact. Cullen did not move. He did not speak. He just looked at her for a long, silent moment. His gray eyes weren't filled with pity or judgment. They were just seeing her. It felt as if he were looking past the words, past the fear, and straight into the fractured heart of her. He seemed to weigh what she'd said not as a flaw, but as a fundamental condition, like the color of her eyes or the way she held her hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "Then I'll stay put," he said. The words were so simple, so direct. They seemed to stop the world on its axis. Lydia could only stare at him, uncomprehending. He took a half-step closer, enough to shorten the space between them from a formal distance to something more personal. "If you feel like you need to disappear, Lydia," he said, and the use of her first name was a quiet shock, a bell ringing in the silent afternoon. "Then you go on and do that, but I won't be going anywhere. And if you decide to come back, I'll be right here. I'll be right where you left me." He had not only heard her deepest fear, he had accepted it and offered her the one thing she never thought she'd find an anchor. Not a cage to hold her, but a fixed point in the storm, a place to return to. He wasn't promising to fix her or to change her. He was promising to withstand her. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, hot and unfamiliar. She did not let them fall. She could only nod, a single, shaky movement, unable to speak past the lump that had formed in her throat. For the first time since she'd met him, a slow, genuine smile touched Cullen Wade's lips. It transformed his serious face, softening the hard lines and lighting his eyes from within. "Now," he said, his voice returning to its normal, practical tone. "I believe Mrs. Gable's pecan pie is worth fighting for, and I'd be honored if you'd let me get you a slice." He held out his arm. It was an invitation, a simple gesture that meant everything. It was a choice to step back into the shadows of her lonely room, or to step forward, into the light of the afternoon, at his side. Lydia looked at his outstretched arm, then back at his steady, waiting face, and with a courage she never knew she possessed, she took it. Walking beside Cullen Wade at the Founders' Day picnic had felt like stepping into a different version of her own life. In the weeks that followed, that new life began to feel less like a temporary visit and more like a place she could inhabit. The town's whispers did not cease, but they lost their power over her. When she walked down the street and felt Mrs. Gable's eyes on her back, she no longer flinched. The truth she had found in Cullen's steady gaze was a far more potent force than the town's collective imagination. Their courtship, if it could be called that, unfolded in the same quiet, unhurried way as their first conversations. There were no grand pronouncements or flowery poems. Instead, there was the language of small, steady things. He began to meet her at the end of her workday, waiting for her on the bench outside the post office. They would walk the length of the town and back as twilight settled, the conversation meandering from the price of feed to the book she was currently reading. He would leave a cluster of wild prairie roses on the counter for her in the morning, their delicate scent a stark contrast to the utilitarian smell of ink and sealing wax. She, in turn, would save him the last slice of Mrs. Hannah's apple pie when she knew he was coming into town. She was learning him, not through stories of his past, but through the man he was in the present. She saw his patience with a skittish new horse, his hand gentle but firm on its muzzle. She saw his fairness with his ranch hands, listening to their concerns with a seriousness that gave them dignity. And she saw the deep, unspoken loneliness in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking, a loneliness that mirrored her own. She was changing, and for the first time, the change didn't frighten her. The brittle shell she had built around herself was softening, not cracking. She found herself smiling more, a real smile that reached her eyes. She even engaged in a brief, pleasant conversation with Mrs. Gable about the weather, an act that felt like a small, personal victory. She had not disappeared. She had not run, and every day, Cullen was still there, his presence a quiet, constant promise. "I'll be right here." Then the storm came. It was not like the cleansing rain they had shared on that first night. This storm was a malevolent entity, born in the high peaks and sweeping down into the hollow with a vicious, predatory speed. The sky turned the color of a deep bruise, and the air grew thick and heavy, charged with a strange, metallic scent. The wind howled like a hungry animal, tearing at roofs and rattling window panes. Lydia was in Mrs. Hannah's parlor, watching the awesome, terrifying display through the front window. The lightning was not in flickers, but in great, blinding sheets that bleached the world white for a split second, followed by claps of thunder so immediate and violent they seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. "God have mercy on anyone caught out in this." "Mrs." Hannah murmured, her needle stilled in her hand. Lydia's first thought was of him, Of the ranch, the open pastures, the animals. A cold knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. She told herself he was sensible, that he would have taken shelter long before the worst of it hit. But the knot remained, a hard, cold premonition. The worst of the storm raged for an hour before it finally began to move on, its fury grumbling away toward the eastern plains. It left behind a world battered and soaked, the street a river of mud and debris. And then, through the receding roar, came another sound, the frantic, desperate pounding of hooves. A horse and rider burst into view, galloping recklessly through the flooded street. It was Billy, the young redhead from Cullen's ranch. He wasn't wearing a hat, and his face was stark white, a mask of sheer terror. He pulled his horse to a rearing, sliding stop in front of the dressmaker's shop, vaulted from the saddle before the animal was even still, and scrambled onto the boardwalk. Lydia had the door open before he reached it.
Billy, what is it? What's wrong?
The boy was gasping for air, his clothes plastered to his skin, his eyes wide with shock. It's Mr. Wade," he choked out, his words tumbling over each other.
The lightning. It struck the big cottonwood by the corral. The horses, they went crazy. The big roan mare, she tried to bolt, smashed through the fence. Mr. Wade, he threw himself in front of her, tried to turn her. She trampled him. He's hurt bad, Miss McKenna, real bad. Every drop of blood seemed to drain from Lydia's body. The room tilted, Mrs. Hannah's steadying hand on her arm was the only thing that kept her upright. The old fears, the ones she had thought were dormant, rose up with the force of a tidal wave. Asterisk, this is it, a voice screamed inside her head. Asterisk, this is the complication, the pain, the reason to run. Her first, overwhelming instinct was to retreat, to flee back to the safety of her small, empty room. This was too much. This was the kind of messy, painful entanglement she had sworn to avoid. Loving someone, she realized with sickening clarity, meant opening yourself up to the terror of losing them. Her legs felt weak, her mind a chaotic whirl of panic. Asterisk, disappear. Asterisk, the voice whispered. Asterisk, just disappear, and you won't have to feel this. She could see it so clearly, her trunk packed. A ticket for the morning stagecoach, another town, another quiet room, another life of numbing safety. But then, through the fog of her panic, another voice cut through. His voice, asterisk, I won't be going anywhere. And if you decide to come back, I'll be right here. He had stayed. Through her coldness, her fear, her impossible warnings, he had stayed. He had planted his feet and waited for her. And now, when he was broken and helpless, was she going to be the one who ran? She looked at Billy's terrified face, at Mrs. Hannah's worried one. She thought of Cullen lying injured and alone, save for a handful of frightened ranch hands. The battle inside her lasted only a second, but it was the most decisive battle of her life. The fear was still there, a cold, sickening dread. But for the first time, another feeling was stronger, the fierce, protective, undeniable force of her love for him. Billy,
she said, her voice shaking but firm. Is the doctor there? Yes, ma'am. Doc Miller. He sent me to fetch more laudanum from his office.
Good.
She turned to Mrs. Hannah. I need your buggy, and blankets, and bandages. Anything you have.
Mrs.
Hannah simply nodded, her eyes filled with a deep, knowing approval.
It's all in the linen press. Child, go.
The journey to the ranch was a nightmare. The road was nearly impassable, the buggy sliding and lurching through the deep mud. The sky wept a steady, miserable drizzle. But Lydia's mind was clear, her purpose absolute. She was no longer running from anything. She was running asterisk to asterisk him. The ranch house was a scene of hushed, grim activity. A few worried-looking men stood on the porch, their hats in their hands, the local doctor, A grim-faced man with tired eyes was just leaving as she pulled up. "Miss McKenna," he said, his surprise evident. "He's alive. A miracle. That, several broken ribs, a nasty blow to the head. He's strong as an ox, but he's in a bad way. The next day or so will tell the tale. He needs quiet, and he needs someone to make sure he stays put." The doctor's gaze was pointed. He had seen the way Cullen looked at her in town. Lydia nodded, clutching her basket of supplies. "I will." She stepped inside. The main room of the ranch house was simple, masculine. It smelled of leather, wood smoke, and now the sharp, medicinal scent of liniment. Through an open doorway, she could see the bedroom. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she walked toward it. He was lying on his back in the narrow bed. A single quilt pulled up to his waist. His shirt was gone, his chest tightly bound with white bandages. Another bandage was wrapped around his head, stark against his dark hair. His face, usually tanned and weathered, was pale and bruised. A long, angry scratch running down one cheek. He was utterly, terrifyingly still. She stopped in the doorway, her heart clenching with a pain so sharp it took her breath away. This strong, vital man, this anchor in her stormy life, was laid low, as fragile as a fallen tree. And then his eyes opened, or perhaps they had been open all along. They found her across the room, and even through the haze of pain, the look in them was the same. It was the same steady, unwavering, soul-deep gaze that had met hers on the day she first arrived in Larkspur Hollow. It held no questions, no demands. It just saw her. She walked slowly to the side of the bed and knelt on the floor so their eyes were level. She reached out and gently took his hand. It was calloused and warm, but his grip was weak. Tears she could no longer hold back welled in her eyes and traced silent paths down her cheeks. She had to tell him. He had to know that she had fought her battle and won, that she had chosen. "I changed my mind," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. She leaned closer, her words meant for him alone. "I'm staying." For a long moment, he just looked at her. Then, the corner of his mouth twitched, and a slow, faint smile spread across his lips. It was a small, pained thing, but it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was acceptance. It was relief. It was home. The days that followed settled into a rhythm dictated by necessity and a quiet, unspoken devotion. Lydia's life now had two poles, the Larkspur Hollow Post Office and Cullen Wade's ranch. She arranged with a surprised but understanding Mr. Finch to work only in the mornings, handling the bulk of the incoming mail. As soon as the noon sun climbed high, she would trade her ink-stained apron for a bonnet and make the journey out of town. The path to the ranch became as familiar to her as the lines on her own hands. She learned the dip in the road where water pooled after a rain, the gnarled oak tree that looked like a praying man, the high ridge where the wind always seemed to sing a mournful song. It was a pilgrimage she made each day, leaving the woman she had been a little further behind with every step. Her arrival at the ranch was never announced. She would simply let herself into the quiet house, her basket laden with supplies from the general store or a fresh loaf of bread from Mrs. Hannah's oven. The first week was a blur of grim, focused tasks. Doc Miller had shown her how to clean and redress the angry scrapes on his side, and how to check the bandage on his head. These moments were exercises in profound intimacy, conducted in near silence. Lydia would move with a gentle, practiced efficiency, her touch light but sure as she cleaned his skin with a cloth dipped in warm, herb-infused water. Cullen, for his part, endured it with a stoic patience that was more difficult for her to witness than any cry of pain would have been. He would lie still, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. He never complained, never flinched away from her touch. He simply allowed her to care for him, and for a man as fiercely independent as Cullen Wade. Lydia knew that this vulnerability was the ultimate act of trust. He was letting her see him broken, and in doing so, was giving her the strongest, most vital part of himself. She brought order to his small, bachelor's home. It was a clean place, but it lacked a gentle hand. She washed the curtains and let the sunlight stream in. She swept the wide plank floors until they shone. She learned the geography of his kitchen, a place that had clearly been used for function rather than comfort. She simmered broths and hearty stews on the cast-iron stove, the savory scents filling the house and chasing away the sterile smell of medicine. The work grounded her. Each simple, repetitive task: kneading dough, stirring a pot, mending a tear in his shirt, a prayer for his recovery. His ranch hands, a quiet and respectful crew, treated her with a shy reverence. They would leave buckets of fresh milk and baskets of eggs on the porch, never knocking, never intruding. They saw what she was doing. She was tending not just to their boss, but to the heart of the ranch itself. As the days turned into a week, and then 2, Cullen began to mend. The deep bruises on his face faded from a violent purple to a pale, sickly yellow, and then disappeared altogether. He graduated from being confined to his bed to sitting in a large armchair by the window, a blanket over his legs. He still did not speak much. Words seemed to be a foreign currency to him, something to be used sparingly and only when necessary. His communication was in his eyes. He would watch her as she moved about the room, his gaze following her with a quiet intensity that was more eloquent than any sonnet. It was a look of gratitude, of wonder, of a deep and abiding tenderness that made her heart ache in a way that was both sweet and painful. He began to reclaim small parts of his life. He would sit for hours with a piece of leather and a set of tools, his hands, though slow, still sure as he repaired a broken bridle. He would whittle pieces of scrap wood into small, smooth shapes: a bird, a horse, a star, leaving them on the mantelpiece without comment. He was a man who spoke with his hands, and Lydia learned to read the language of his work. One afternoon, she was inside, kneading bread, her hands dusted with flour. He was on the porch, directing Billy on how to properly reset a loose fence post in the near pasture. His voice carried on the still air, not loud, but low and clear, each word filled with an easy authority and an unshakable patience. "No, son," he said, his voice a calm rumble. "You're rushing it. Set the post first. Let it find its footing. Then you pack the earth. The foundation is everything." Lydia's hands stilled in the soft dough. She closed her eyes and just listened to the sound of his voice. It was the sound of strength, of competence, of a quiet and certain wisdom. And without thinking, without any conscious decision, a slow, warm smile spread across her face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated joy, a feeling so new, so potent, it almost brought tears to her eyes. The fear that had been her constant companion for years felt, in that moment, like a distant memory, a ghost from someone else's life. The afternoons became her favorite time. After the midday meal, when the ranch settled into a quiet hum of activity, she would bring 2 chairs onto the front porch. She would bring her mending basket, and he would bring whatever piece of tack he was working on. They would sit together for an hour or more, often without exchanging a single word. The silence between them was a living thing, as rich and comfortable as the patchwork quilt on her bed. It was filled with the rhythmic creak of his rocking chair, the soft snip of her scissors, the distant lowing of cattle, and the sigh of the wind through the tall prairie grass. From that porch, the world seemed vast and peaceful. The mountains stood etched against the blue sky, solid and eternal. This, she thought one golden afternoon, watching a hawk circle high above, this is what peace feels like. It wasn't the absence of trouble, but the presence of a steady, grounding force beside her. Her fears had not vanished entirely. They were still there, a part of her story, but they had lost their power. They were whispers now, not screams. Here, on this worn wooden porch, with this quiet, resilient man by her side, The profound and simple peace she felt was real. The fear was just a shadow, and she was no longer afraid of shadows. She looked over at him. He had set aside his leather work and was watching her, his head tilted slightly. A faint, knowing smile touched his lips, as if he knew exactly what she was thinking. He reached over, his hand covering hers where it rested on the arm of her chair. His touch was warm and sure. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had become. Lydia turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. She leaned her head back, closed her eyes, and let the warmth of the afternoon sun fall upon her face. She was home. Cullen's recovery was as steady and quiet as the man himself. The deep bruises faded, the cuts healed, and strength returned to his limbs. Soon he was no longer confined to the porch, but was walking the fence lines, his stride even and sure, his presence once again commanding the rhythm of the ranch. Lydia's role shifted from nurse to companion. The afternoons on the porch became the anchor of her days, a time of shared silence and easy conversation that felt more like home than any place she had ever known. The peace she had found was no longer a fragile, new thing, but a deep, settled certainty. The world, however, has a long memory, and the past is never as far away as it seems. The disruption came in a canvas mailbag, in the form of a letter yellowed with age. Its ink faded to a ghostly brown. It had been sent years ago to a family that had long since moved on from Larkspur Hollow, and it had been lost in the vast, indifferent machinery of the postal service, only to surface now, a relic from a forgotten time, as part of her duties. Lydia was tasked with opening such dead letters to see if a return address could be found. She slit the brittle envelope carefully. The letter was from a soldier, a private named Silas Croft, and it was dated from the final year of the war. As her eyes scanned the faded script, the blood began to drain from her face. "Tell you about Sergeant Wade," the letter read. "They've charged him with desertion, but it's a lie. Ma, Captain Hollister is a venomous man, trading army supplies for his own profit, and he sent our platoon out to draw fire from a position he knew was a death trap, all to cover his own tracks. Sergeant Wade was the only one who saw it for what it was. He refused the order. He told us to hold our position and save our lives. He saved us. Ma, he faced down Hollister for us, and now they're trying to break him for it. If you see his family, you tell them he is the bravest man I ever knew." Lydia's hands trembled. She sat there in the dusty silence of the post office, the letter a testament to an unimaginable history, a deserter. The town's ugliest whisper was true, but the story behind it was one of honor, not cowardice. Mr. Finch found her that way, pale and still, the letter clutched in her hand. He read it, his face growing grim. A man of quiet principles. Mr. Finch had connections from his own time in the service. He sent a telegraph message that very afternoon to the regional army headquarters, making an official inquiry. The reply came 2 days later, a crisp, official document that laid out the facts in cold, bureaucratic language. Sergeant Cullen Wade, it stated, had been charged with insubordination and desertion in the face of the enemy. An inquiry had been conducted. Captain Hollister had been found guilty of dereliction of duty and trading with the enemy. Sergeant Wade had been fully and honorably exonerated of all charges, his record cleared. The news ripped through Larkspur Hollow like a prairie fire. The letter and the telegram became public knowledge, dissected and debated in the general store and over the saloon bar. For some, like Mrs. Hannah and Mr. Finch, it was a vindication. They held their heads high, their faith in Cullen's character rewarded. "Told you so," Mrs. Hannah said with grim satisfaction. "Still waters run deep." But for others, the truth was an inconvenience. Mrs. Gable and her circle were not so easily swayed from their long-held narrative. To admit they were wrong was to relinquish their power, so they simply changed the story. Exonerated or not, Mrs. Gable declared over a bolt of calico.
He still defied a direct order, a troublemaker. It's in his nature. A man like that is unpredictable. You never know when he might turn. Where there's smoke, there's fire, another woman chimed in. The army must have had its reasons to charge him in the first place. The whispers didn't die. They simply put on new clothes. He was no longer a coward, but now he was a malcontent, a man with a rebellious streak, a history of violence and defiance. He was marked for Lydia. The revelation was a seismic shock. Her carefully constructed peace crumbled. This wasn't about the town's gossip. She believed the letter. She believed in his honor. The truth of it was more terrifying than any lie. The quiet, steady man she had fallen in love with had a past of unimaginable turmoil. He had stood on a battlefield, faced down a corrupt captain, and been condemned by the very institution he served. He had been through an inferno she couldn't possibly comprehend. Her own past, her quiet heartbreak with Arthur, felt trivial, childish in comparison. How could she, a woman who had been broken by a simple change of heart, stand beside a man who had weathered such profound injustice? The scale of his past was immense, a vast, dark ocean, and she was standing at the edge, afraid she would drown. The old instinct, the powerful, primal urge to flee, returned with a vengeance. It was not a fear of him, but a fear of the world's capacity for cruelty, a cruelty he had faced head-on. It was a fear of her own inadequacy in the face of it. The quiet life she had built with him felt like a fragile sandcastle, and the tide of his history was rolling in to wash it all away. She retreated. It wasn't a conscious decision, but a slow, creeping withdrawal. She stopped making the trip to the ranch in the afternoons, pleading a backlog of work at the post office. When he came into town, she was polite but distant. The comfortable silence between them replaced once more by a strained quiet. The smile she gave him didn't reach her eyes. She was pulling away, brick by painful brick, rebuilding the walls she had so recently torn down. He watched her retreat with a deep, knowing sadness in his eyes. But he did not press her. He did not demand an explanation. He gave her the space she was so desperately, silently demanding. After a week of this agonizing distance, he found her. She was sitting on the bench outside the closed post office as dusk settled, wrapping the town in shades of lavender and gray. She was supposed to have met him, and she had not shown up. He didn't approach with anger or accusation. He simply sat down at the other end of the bench, leaving a careful space between them. "The whole town's talking," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet evening. He wasn't looking at her, but at the last sliver of orange sun disappearing behind the mountains. Lydia couldn't look at him. She stared at her own hands, clenched tightly in her lap. "I know. They got the story wrong at first," he continued, his tone even. "And they've got it wrong now. But that's not what this is about. Is it?" "No," she whispered, her throat tight. He was silent for a long time, giving her a chance to speak. When she didn't, he finally turned his head to look at her. "Lydia, talk to me." "I can't," she said, the words choked with a confusion she couldn't name. It's too much. The things you went through, the injustice of it. It's a part of you, a whole world that I know nothing about. It's so big, and it's so full of pain. And She trailed off, unable to articulate the heart of her fear. "I'm not strong enough for it." He listened, his expression somber. He understood what she wasn't saying. He saw the terror in her eyes, the terror of a person who had only ever known shallow waters suddenly being shown the depths of the ocean. He did not try to reassure her. He did not tell her it was all in the past or that it didn't matter. He honored her fear by acknowledging the truth of it. "It was a long time ago," he said softly. "But you're right, it's a part of my story. It made me who I am." He paused, his gaze steady and unwavering. "But it doesn't have to be a part of yours if you don't want it to be." Her head snapped up, and she stared at him, her eyes wide with surprise. He wasn't fighting for her. He was letting her go. He was giving her the exit she was too cowardly to take for herself. He stood up then, a tall, solid silhouette against the fading light. He looked down at her, his face a mask of sorrow, but his voice, when he spoke, held the same unshakable core of certainty she had heard on that first rainy night. "I haven't changed my mind, Lydia," he said. "Not about you." And then he turned and walked away, his footsteps receding into the growing darkness, leaving her alone on the bench, more lost and heartbroken than she had ever been in her life. The silence Cullen left behind on the bench was a hollow, aching thing. It followed Lydia back to her small room above the dressmaker's shop and filled every corner, becoming a presence more suffocating than any noise. She sat on the edge of her bed in the darkness, the muted sounds of the town settling for the night feeling as if they came from a different world. He had let her go. He had given her the freedom she had always claimed to want, and it felt like a cage. In his final, quiet words, "I haven't changed my mind," he had laid the choice squarely at her feet. He would not change, but she could choose fear. She could choose the cold, lonely safety of a life without complication, without the terrifying, magnificent weight of a love that had seen war and injustice and had not broken. By dawn, she had convinced herself that leaving was the only honorable thing to do. It was a kindness, she reasoned, a bitter sort of mercy. She would not tether a man like him to her own inconstancy. She would not ask him to bear the burden of her skittish heart. She would disappear, just as she had warned him she might, and he would be free. It was a lie she told herself, a noble excuse masking the simple, ugly truth she was a coward. The act of packing was a quiet torment. Each object she folded into her trunk was a betrayal. The pale blue calico dress she had worn to the picnic felt like the costume of a braver woman she had only pretended to be. The book he had tried to give her, the one she had later, humbly accepted, lay on her nightstand, its cover a silent accusation. She wrapped it in cloth and placed it at the very bottom of the trunk. She wrote 2 letters. The first, to Mr. Finch, was a formal, stilted resignation, offering her deepest regrets. The second, to Mrs. Hannah, was harder. "Thank you for your kindness," she wrote, the ink blurring as a single tear fell onto the page. "You were a better friend to me than I was to myself." She left the notes on her dresser, propped against the clean, empty water basin. She crept down the stairs in the gray, pre-dawn light, her single trunk a heavy, solid weight of regret in her hand. The town was asleep, shrouded in a soft mist that muffled the sound of her footsteps. The stagecoach office was her destination, the logical next step. But her feet, acting on an impulse her mind could not control, did not turn toward the main street. They turned east, onto the familiar, rutted road that led out of town. She told herself it was to say goodbye, a final, silent farewell to the place where she had, for a brief, shining moment, felt like she belonged. She walked, her breath pluming in the cool air, the weight of the trunk seeming to grow with every step. She reached the turnoff to his ranch just as the first rays of sun crested the mountains, bathing the landscape in a soft, ethereal light. She stopped at the gate, the simple wooden barrier that marked the edge of his world. From here, she could see the house, a dark, solid shape with a curl of smoke beginning to rise from its chimney. She could see the porch where they had sat, the corral where he had worked, the vast, open pastures that stretched to the horizon. It was all so peaceful, so real, so much his. She stood there, her hand resting on the cool, damp wood of the gate, and allowed herself to remember. The memories came not as a gentle stream, but as a flood, overwhelming the dam of fear she had so carefully constructed. She remembered the sight of him lying in his bed, broken and pale, and the sheer, indomitable strength in his eyes as they found hers across the room. He had been at his weakest, yet his spirit was the strongest thing she had ever witnessed.
She remembered an afternoon on the porch, a week before the letter arrived. She had been mending a shirt, and he had been eating a piece of bread, fresh from Mrs. Hannah's oven. Without a word, he had broken the piece in half and held it out to her, his hand calloused and scarred from a lifetime of hard work, offering her a simple share of his meal. It was not a grand gesture, but it was everything. It was partnership. It was sustenance. She remembered the weight of the wool blanket he had wrapped around her shoulders in the storm, the scent of cedar and clean wool a shield against the raging night. She remembered his voice, low and certain, cutting through the roar of the rain asterisk. Are you cold asterisk? A simple question that had carried the weight of the world. She remembered his slow smile at the picnic, the one that had transformed his serious face and made her heart feel like it was taking flight. And she remembered his quiet, unyielding promise asterisk. If you decide to come back, I'll be right here. All these moments, these small, solid truths, rose up against the vast, terrifying specter of his past. The war, the injustice, the betrayal those things had happened asterisk to asterisk him. But the quiet kindness, the unwavering patience, the steadfast heart that was who he asterisk was asterisk. She had been so afraid of the story of his life that she had failed to truly see the man living it, the man who had shown her, time and again, that he was not a man who runs. And she was standing at his gate, about to do just that. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. Leaving wasn't kindness, it was the ultimate cruelty. It was telling him that everything he had offered her, his trust, his patience, his heart, was not enough to make her stay. It was proving the town's whispers right in the worst possible way, not about him, but about her. She was the unpredictable one. She was the one who turned away. A great, shuddering sob escaped her lips. She dropped the handle of her trunk, the thud muffled by the damp earth. She looked from the house, her sanctuary, to the road, her escape, and the choice was suddenly, blindingly clear. Fear was a prison, but love, this quiet, steady, resilient love, was the key. She turned. She did not bother with the trunk. She left it sitting there by the side of the road, a monument to a life she was now leaving behind for good. And she began to walk, then to run, back through the gate and down the long lane toward the house, toward him. She found him in the barn, the wide doors thrown open to the morning light. The air inside smelled of hay and leather and horse. He was standing over a saddle stand, a curved needle and a length of waxed thread in his hands, his head bent in concentration as he mended a torn fender. He was working. The world had not stopped. He was simply being who he was. He must have heard her footsteps, because he stopped his work and looked up. He saw her standing there, breathless, her hair coming loose from its pins, her dress damp with morning dew. He took in the sight of her, and his face, which had been set in lines of grim concentration, softened. There was no anger in his eyes. There was no accusation. There was only a deep, profound, and weary relief. He did not ask where she had been. He did not ask why she had come. He simply put his tools down on the workbench and waited. She walked toward him until she was only a few feet away, close enough to see the exhaustion and the sorrow that he had been carrying for the past week. "I warned you," she said, her voice a raw, shaky whisper. "I warned you that I changed my mind." A slow, sad smile touched his lips. It was the smile of a man who had held on to a single, stubborn hope in the face of impossible odds and had just seen it proven true. He looked at her, his gaze holding all the rainy nights, the quiet afternoons, and the silent promises that had passed between them. "And I told you," he said, his voice low and steady as the earth beneath their feet, "that I don't." The space between them in the barn was charged, not with tension, but with the profound, bone-deep relief that comes after a long and desperate battle. His words, "I don't," hung in the air, a final, unbreakable promise that settled the last of the turmoil in Lydia's soul. She didn't have to be steady because he was. She didn't have to be unshakable because he was. All she had to be was here. He took a step forward and gently took the needle and thread from her unresisting fingers, placing them carefully on the workbench. Then he took her hands in his. They were cold, and he chafed them gently, his rough, warm palms bringing life back into her fingertips. He didn't pull her into an embrace. He didn't demand the tears or the confession of her near flight. He just stood there, holding her hands, anchoring her to the present moment, to the solid earth beneath their feet.
"There's a trunk,"
she finally whispered, her voice hoarse.
"by the main road, at the gate."
He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'll fetch it." The walk back to the house was a silent one. He did not ask her to explain the trunk, and she did not offer. The explanation was in the simple fact that she had returned without it. As they stepped onto the porch, he gestured for her to go inside, and then he turned and walked, his long stride even and unhurried, down the lane. Lydia stood in the center of his simple home, the home she had brought a tentative warmth to, and then had abandoned. It smelled of him of wood smoke, leather, and coffee. It was the scent of safety. She went to the stove and, moving on instinct, began to build up the fire from the morning's embers. It was a simple, domestic act, an act of rebuilding, of tending the hearth. By the time he returned, carrying her heavy trunk as if it weighed nothing at all, a small, steady flame was dancing in the stove and a pot of coffee was beginning to heat. He set the trunk down by the door without a word. It was a scar, a tangible piece of evidence from her moment of weakness, and he brought it into the heart of his home and left it there, accepting it as part of the story. He didn't hide it or cast it out. He simply made room for it. The rest of the day passed in a series of these small, unspoken acts of healing. They moved around each other in the small kitchen, preparing a simple meal of bacon, eggs, and the last of Mrs. Hannah's bread. Their movements were a quiet choreography, a relearning of each other's space. He would reach for a plate, and she would already be passing it to him. She would look for the salt, and he would place it in her hand. There were no apologies, no recriminations. There was only the shared, comforting rhythm of a life being pieced back together. As night fell, a chill crept into the air. The sky outside the window was a deep, velvet black, studded with a million impossibly bright stars. Cullen went outside and returned with an armload of firewood. He built a fire in the stone hearth, the logs catching quickly, their crackling a cheerful counterpoint to the vast silence of the prairie night. The firelight cast a warm, golden glow across the room, softening the hard lines of the furniture and throwing their dancing shadows against the walls. He pulled his armchair close to the hearth and gestured for her to take the smaller rocking chair beside it. For a long time, they just sat, watching the flames devour the wood. The heat was a comfort on her face. The silence was not empty. It was full of everything that had been said and everything that no longer needed to be. It was the silence of arrival after a long and perilous journey. Lydia watched his profile in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw, the quiet set of his mouth, the way the light caught the weathered lines around his eyes. She thought of the man the world saw the quiet rancher, the rumored deserter, the man who kept to himself. And she thought of the man she knew, the man who had wrapped a blanket around her in a storm, who had accepted her flawed and frightened truth without judgment, who had lain broken in a bed but had never been defeated. He was a man of quiet, immense strength, a strength born not from the absence of hardship, but from the overcoming of it. Slowly, tentatively, she stood up from the rocking chair. He turned his head, his expression questioning but patient. She moved the few steps to his chair and sank to the floor beside him, resting her back against the warm, solid wood of its frame. She drew her knees to her chest, feeling the heat of the fire on her shins. It was a small movement, but it was a closing of a distance. He looked down at her, and a small, soft smile touched his lips. He reached down and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, his calloused fingers unbelievably gentle. His hand lingered for a moment, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, a touch that was both a question and a comfort. And then, Lydia did the thing she had never done before. She leaned. She let the last of her defenses fall away and turned, resting her head against his thigh, her cheek finding the rough, sturdy fabric of his trousers. Through the material, she could feel the solid warmth of him, the unyielding strength she had so foolishly tried to run from. She closed her eyes, and for the first time, she did not keep a single inch of herself in reserve. She gave him all her weight, all her trust. His hand came to rest on her hair, his fingers gently stroking, a steady, rhythmic gesture that seemed to soothe the last, frayed edges of her soul. They sat like that for a long, timeless moment, listening to the crackle and pop of the fire. The world was reduced to this small, warm circle of light, to the solid presence of him beside her, to the steady beat of her own, finally calm, heart. She had to say it one last time, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a final, honest confession of who she was. She was giving him this last piece of her, the difficult, changeable part, knowing, finally, that he was strong enough to hold it. "I could still change my mind, you know," she whispered to the fire, her voice soft in the quiet room. She felt, more than heard, the low chuckle that rumbled in his chest. His hand stilled in her hair, and then his fingers tightened gently, a gesture of quiet possession, of absolute certainty. He leaned down, his voice a low, warm murmur near her ear, laced with a smile. "Then go ahead and change it," he said. "But don't you leave my arms." And with those words, the last of the ice around her heart melted away. The cold, persistent fear that had been her companion for years, the fear of being too much, of changing too much, of loving and losing, was gone. It had not been vanquished in a great and glorious battle, but had simply dissolved in the face of a love that was stronger, quieter, and more stubborn than any fear could ever be. She could change her mind 1,000 times, about the weather, about the color of a dress, about the path they took on a walk, but she would never again change her mind about this. Lydia turned her face into his side, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and safety. She was no longer the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach, braced against the world. She was not even the woman who had packed her trunk in the gray light of dawn. She was a woman who had finally found her footing, not on solid ground, but in the steadfast heart of a man who refused to let go, and for the first time in a very long time, she was not afraid. Thank you for listening to this story. Let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from today. It's wonderful to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please consider hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.